안녕하세요. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Chey Institute of Advanced Studies special lecture, The Next 50 Years, a special lecture by Dr. George Friedman, the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. Now today my name is Sun Chey, professor at Ewha Women's University. In the current COVID-19 era, we are all living through unprecedented times, experiencing changes that we have never experienced before. Even for Chey Institute, it's been over 8 months since we've actually had an overseas speaker here in person to speak to us today. So it is a very interesting and a very exciting time today. And so we are very excited to open this series with someone who could give us some insights into the geopolitical future that we will experience after COVID-19. But first, we would like to invite President Park In-guk of the Chey Institute of Advanced Studies to give us his welcoming remarks.
To warmly welcome all of you who are joining us on YouTube today, I'd like to especially extend my heartfelt appreciation to Dr. George Friedman, who endured through travel from Texas to Seoul and the COVID-19 testing in Incheon Airport. In response to the coronavirus outbreak and its constraints on public gathering, the Chey Institute has hosted 5 consecutive online seminars or webinars, inviting experts from various backgrounds to explore the prospect of vaccine development and social impacts of this unforeseen global crisis. The Chey Institute for Advanced Studies was established 2 years ago to commemorate the 20th year of the passing of Chairman Chong-hyun, former chairman of SK Group and the founding father of Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. During his lifetime, he had an unswerving dedication to modernize Korea by investing in human capital, including sending promising young Korean college students to study abroad to earn PhDs, mainly in the United States. As a result, more than 1,000 students earned their PhDs, mostly from top universities around the world. We established our institute in honor of the late Chairman Chey. With this solid intellectual foundation, the Chey Institute was launched to expand the international academic network and to exclusively focus on the following. First, to identify geopolitical risk in Northeast Asia and beyond. Second, to explore current and future trends in scientific innovation and identify its risk. Third, to analyze the impact of scientific innovation on geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. As you can see from our mission statement, I believe the Chey Institute and Friedman's Geopolitical Futures could share a common vision to monitor and respond to global crisis and to come up with the possible solutions for the better future of the international community. Ladies and gentlemen, the special lecture has been one of the flagship programs of Chey Institute, providing Korean audiences with a unique opportunity to engage directly with renowned world-class scholars and experts around the world. Today, you are joining us in our first online special lectures. Today, we have Dr. George Friedman, the founder and chairman of the Geopolitical Futures, as the first speaker of this online lecture series. The topic, the next 50 years, couldn't be more appropriate in this period of unprecedented tectonic transformation and challenges. Since the beginning of this year, we have witnessed a series of vicissitudes across the globe that have turned our lives upside down. Albert Einstein famously said, I quote, "If you want to know the future, look at the past," unquote. If we look back 50 years, President Nixon and Kissinger visited China for the first time as US President in 1972. This marked the beginning of the US-China era. However, now we are faced with global challenges with the so-called rise of China, which has been seriously exacerbated in the wake of COVID-19 permeation in all directions across the globe. Dr. Friedman is also known as the famous modern 21st century Nostradamus. I was told that he predicted the course of a war and the Asian financial crisis in advance. The futurists are often faced with pressures to navigate uncharted paths ahead of contemporaries. And I admired Dr. Friedman's for upholding indigenous ideas with great originality and novelty without compromising to popular trends. In particular, I'm eager to hear Dr. Friedman's thought on the challenges and opportunities facing global communities in the next half century. There are various arguments on what could happen in the next 50 years. Especially, I'd like to introduce powerful observation by Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard University. Professor Nye, in our institute, paid a special attention to the Kinderberger trap, the warning against the ramifications resulting from the United States' failure to provide global public goods in early 20th century, especially in the 1920s. The American first policy on the United States in the early 20th century triggered devastating, irreversible effects on the world trade system. It developed the Great Depression, which eventually led to a catastrophic World War II. Based on such painful lesson, any leading world power should provide the relevant global public goods to play the role of true global leaders, whether it is US, China, or both, or third-party countries. I thank you.
Thank you, President Park. As President Park said, it is without question an opportune time to welcome in person Dr. George Friedman, Chairman of Geopolitical Futures, an online publication dedicated to analyzing global events. He has also published many New York Times bestsellers, including The Storm Before the Calm and The Next 100 Years. And as you heard, he is known as a modern forecaster of global affairs, which may explain why the interest in this talk has been so high. And we've gotten hundreds of questions online about our geopolitical future. I think we all feel as if we've suddenly had the rug pulled out from under our feet, and we are grasping for clues as to what the world will look like once we get our foothold back. So without further ado, I would like to turn over the mic to our presenter, Dr. Friedman.
I want to thank you for inviting me here to a place where our two countries have shared much blood and much hope, and to try to think about what comes next for both of us. Because I think that what happens to the United States, Texas, will happen to you too, and we must be together on it. And I think this institute is perfectly built for that purpose. So I'm going to speak now about the next 50 years. In order to do that, I have to go back and tell you how to think about, because it was said that we felt as if the rug were being pulled out from under us this year. I want to show you that we always feel that way. I want to begin by asking you to think about 1900. The Europeans, the British, had a massive empire, controlled the world, shaping Asia, shaping Africa, shaping everything. One thing was certain, that this would last for a very long time. Now I'd like to go to 1920. The Europeans had slaughtered each other, torn each other apart, the most enlightened area of the world. No one in 1900 thought this was going to happen. But it did. And in 1920, we knew this much, that Germany was finished, and this was the war to end all wars. And nobody thought that 20 years later, Germany would rise again, and that the war to end all wars is just a truce between the continuation of war. But in 1940, when we saw Germany rise 20 years later, everybody knew in 1940 the war was over. Germany had won. There was no way. They'd overrun France. They'd taken all these countries. How could they not win? 20 years later, in 1960, Germany is an occupied country, defeated, destroyed in the war, divided between the United States and Russia. And everybody knew in 1960 that the next war would come in Europe, and it would be a nuclear war. And the world was braced for a nuclear war. That never happened. What happened was a war in Vietnam, where the United States was defeated and had tremendous economic problems because of high oil prices, high interest rates, high unemployment. It was a terrible time. And everyone knew that the United States was in decline, that the Soviet Union had managed to bypass the United States, more stable, more powerful. And in 1980, it was very clear to us that we were in decline. We believed it too. In 2000, there was the Soviet Union that collapsed. And no one expected that. And Soviet Union having collapsed, we were now in a single world where everybody was focused on in business, in open borders, and the United States was leading the world to a greater peace and happiness. In 1920 and 2020, that world is fragmenting, collapsing. The struggle between China and the United States is clearly going to define the next 20 years. But as I've shown you, I hope, that the expectations you have about the future are almost always wrong. They're almost always wrong over a period of time because you are extrapolating from a situation that was there and not considering the way that period is unsustainable. So to be able to talk about the 1950s, we have to really understand the belief in 1900 about the permanence of European power, the belief in 1960 that there'd be a nuclear war and be in Europe, and the belief in 2000 that we'd put war behind us because the Soviet Union collapsed. These were all beliefs. They were all wrong. So to begin understanding it, we are always surprised by what happens. We're always stunned by what happens. It is never what we expected. Now, I will say that I try to find the way it will happen. That's my hubris. But it is based on looking at the world in a way that is very simple, very stupid, not sophisticated. Can I have my first slide, please? In order to understand the world, you have to look at it. You have to look at the map of the world and see what it teaches you. Because the map of the world sings you a song about what is true and what is not true in general. And if you look at it simply and for a long time, you discover a very important thing. That over the past 100 years, a massive transformation has happened in the world. Where previously the European powers had been the dominant powers of the world, they lost that dominance. And that the dominant power in the world is the power that controls the Atlantic and the Pacific, the two great oceans, and is not afraid of being attacked by anyone from the outside. So a country that is secure, able to attack others, and controls the oceans where trade takes place, this is a powerful nation. And that nation is obviously the United States. So if you take a look at the world, it consists primarily of 4 islands. There is South America, there is Africa, there is Eurasia, the massive island that stretches from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and there's North America. North America is unique in one way. It is the only power, the only continent, that first is not divided in potential conflict within itself, and secondly, which has access to both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Which means that whatever power is resting there can, at its choice, decide that it has to deal with North Korea or Japan or whoever, and at the same time maybe deal with the Russians in Belarus. That geography shows you how distinct the United States is. When you look at China, it is a great power. There's, of course, no question about that. But it's a power that lives in Eurasia, where every power is separated from the other. China is separated from the rest of Asia by the mountains, the hills and jungles of Southeast Asia, by the Himalayas, by the vast grasslands of Central Asia, by Siberia in the north, and the Pacific to the east. It is part of a continent, but like India, behind the Himalayas, behind the jungles of the east, it's separated. And when you look at Eurasia, you will see a fragmentation. Not a problem. But also, how does China conquer Eurasia? How does India conquer Eurasia? How do they conquer each other? How do you get across the Himalayas? The difference between Eurasia and North America is that there is only one great power, and the boundaries are very, very weak. The United States could go north, could go south, but doesn't want to go anywhere. So when we look at this map, okay, we very quickly can see, we can go into a question later of why South America and Africa are not serious players, but that what the place that had been the great center of humanity and globalism, Eurasia, is now highly fragmented. Europe, the smallest continent in the world, except for Australia, has 52 separate countries. It's a surprise that they fight so much. Russia glowers over Europe. The United States may involve them, may not. China emerges, and so on. And so we have this strange thing. One power resting secure on a continent that it controls with access to all oceans and being a major naval power. Whereas in Eurasia, a fragmentation that either isolates or, as in Europe, creates conflict. These are not powers that are secure, or when they're secure, they're hidden behind hills and mountains and jungles. So this is how we have to understand the hidden structure. When we talk about what happened in 1900 and European empires and what happened later, what happened was this. Europe had sailed to create a global system. Europe had sailed from Portugal, from Spain, later from France, and from England, and created a global system. And they did that by owning the oceans, and they did that by pursuing power. And from that, they created a global system. But Eurasia ripped itself apart, especially in 1945, a war that was stretched from Japan to England. And everything in between was immolated. And they lost that. And what was left intact was North America. And you naturally look at North America, the president, and other leaders, and you say, this country is in decline. Well, it's very hard to decline when there is no threat. You can imagine threats, but we have to look at them very specifically, what those threats are. So today, as in every 20 years, the basic belief is that China is rising, and the United States is declining, and that over time, there may be a war between the two. So let's dig deep into that question. Let's first take a look at China. It is a country divided itself. 4 buffer states surround it. Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet. Right now there's unrest in Inner Mongolia. There's murder going on in Xinjiang and fighting near the Tibetan plain. So this borderland of China that it depends on for its security is currently vastly unstable. Not to mention Hong Kong, which is another sort of borderland that has destabilized. What China is doing very hard is trying to hold itself together. If we forget the newspaper stories, this is a country whose periphery is tearing itself apart, and China is holding it together. There is, in this, a lesson. The difference between the United States and China is the United States, well, we have all sorts of problems, but is not trying to hold its periphery together. China or Mexico or stuff. China is trying desperately to hold it together. Second, we have the problem that China has, which is that it's the world's greatest power, exporting power. Well, the United States is the greatest importing power. And that means that China needs the United States as the customer. But China also needs exports for the same reason that has happened before. In 1890, it was the United States was the great China of the time. By 1900, the United States produced half the industrial products of the world. And we were the major exporter to Europe. And we drove the global economy, and we built ourselves off those exports. But when the Europeans tore themselves to pieces, and the 1920s could no longer buy our products, the United States found itself in a position of every exporter who loses its customers. The Great Depression. There are many reasons for the Great Depression. But the most fundamental one is that the greatest exporting power of that time lost its market. And this was the United States. Now, the United States comes back. And other countries come back too, in different ways. Sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker. We had the same story with Japan after World War II. It was the great low-cost, high-volume exporter to the world. It saturated the world's markets. And it was said in the United States that we'd all had better learn Japanese because they were taking over the world in 1985. Okay? Well, the problem that Japan had was that its customer was the United States. And the United States would set the terms in which they bought the products. The other problem was that they had to sell to survive. They kept cutting prices, cutting profit margins. Their banking system went away. And suddenly the great superpower of Japan found his banking system in chaos. and went into what was called the lost decade. But Japan had an advantage. It was socially harmonious. It was integrated. It did not have borderlands that it was protecting. It had time to reshape itself and reform itself into what it is today, the third largest economy in the world. The problem China has is that it has the same Japanese problem, but with an enormous number of people living in abject poverty. The coastal region connects more to the United States and Europe than to the interior. How can they find markets to sell to in areas that are impoverished? You know, when you hardly have any money, you can't buy an iPad. We researched this. We're almost certain you need more money. And so when you face that the Chinese have this tremendous problem in the West, in the place where Chairman Mao took the long march to raise a military to come back and defeat the imperialists, that same problem has reemerged. So unlike Japan, which had social harmony to a great extent and weathered its decline, or the United States, which weathered its decline in normal chaos of the United States, the Chinese face the old problem. The coast is rich, the interior is poor. All the people who had jobs in the coastal region were sent back home, and they've realized they're not going to participate in this. Not now. Not yet. And so this is China's essential problem. Its essential problem is that it's dependent on exports to maintain its economy. And on no one is it more dependent than the United States. The United States wanted to redefine the terms, wanted access to China's economy. China couldn't grant that access because if it did, well, the markets were too tight, too little room, too little possibilities to accept that. So they had to block access. And the United States said, it is easier for us to find new suppliers than for you to find new customers. And it proceeded to do so. And of course, the Chinese did what the Japanese did. They said, look how wonderfully we're doing. Japanese bought Rockefeller Center. Japanese bought golf courses in the United States. And everybody said, this is proof of Japan's growing wealth, power. To which the question is, if Japan was such a good place to invest, why didn't they invest there? Why are they buying buildings in the United States? And so, too, you see apartments all over the world, in Australia, in the west coast of the United States, and Canada, being purchased. Why are they buying apartments here? They sometimes don't occupy them. The capital flight, which is one of the problems of a climaxing economy. Well, one of the problems is that as capital flight occurs, capital is lost. It flees the country. It goes elsewhere. Now, these are the objective problems that China is facing. It is not dissimilar to the problems the United States faced. It's not dissimilar to the problems Japan faced. It's not an embarrassment, nor does it mean the end of it, except that China really has another problem that it faces, which is a military one. One of the great fears of China is that the United States will impose a blockade on its ports. If it imposes a blockade on the ports, China cannot export. Now, China has one strategy, one road, one belt, which says we will have an extremely more expensive transportation system, but it will go to Europe, which will happen to go through some of the most unstable areas of Eurasia, where everything from terrorist groups to governments can block the road. Okay? Well, it's a good idea if it could work, but it's hard to see it working. But the real problem is seen in the South China Sea. The Chinese badly want to push the Americans away from their ports to guarantee their security. The United States is quite happy being in a position of controlling China through being close to the ports. The idea here is that China is a rising power. Well, there are many ways you can look at this. We can say it's a rising power. It has 1.5 aircraft carriers, the half being one that was developed by the Ukrainians, and they bought from the Ukrainians, and another one that's real. The US has 10 aircraft carriers. Yes, there are rockets, there are missiles, there are very many things. But China also has to watch its back. The US is developing a relationship with India, and this is Eurasia, and it's always possible for the Indians to strike in some way. Russia is unknown and unpredictable. How will it react? Their assumption is that it wants an alliance with China. But there is no alliance. They just speak to each other. So China is in a terribly difficult place. In 10 years of demanding that the US withdraw, China has not gained an inch in the South China Sea. There's been no movement. And the United States has not in any way said that it was going to blockade, nor that it was frightened by the Chinese Navy. And what do I do? They say we will invade Taiwan. They don't say it, but they have that option. Well, they have 6 amphibious craft. In the long journey, starting at a port that can be bombed, going across a sea where they can be attacked from submarines, and then have to resupply over and over again, there's a reason why they haven't invaded Taiwan. They can't. The interesting thing about China is that it does not have to make claims about what it can do. People outside of China make the claims of what it can do. And these are many countries that are hoping that the United States will, in fact, go into decline. But how does a country go into decline when nothing is threatening it? When it's secure in its base, it controls the oceans, and very frankly, doesn't need much from the rest of the world. And so when we look at the next 50 years, we begin by saying, look, the United States is what Europe was for 500 years. Whatever power dominates North America dominates the world's oceans. And if they operate the world's oceans, they can at one time have a Cold War with the Russians or the Soviets, then have a confrontation with the Chinese, not have to engage in either case, but be able to assert its power as it wishes. Now, there are many nations that would wish that the United States would decline. We're an unpleasant people. The Americans are not the kind of people you want to have around. And besides that, other people would like to replace it. That's not happening. It seems to be happening, but it isn't happening. What instead is happening is that China is weakening. Its ability to solve the problems that I described is limited. It's not going to collapse. It's not going to disappear. Although for 100 years before 1947, China was nothing but civil war. But maybe it won't have to be that way again. But certainly, it is not something that is going to be able to reach out into the Atlantic, into the Mediterranean, into the Middle East. It is not going to be a global power. It is struggling to become a regional power. So we see that, and we see with the Russians that the Russians have not solved the problem that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not the end of this episode. It was the beginning of the new one. In the time that Putin took over from Yeltsin, Russia has failed to develop a modern economy. It is dependent on the export of oil and natural gas for about 30 to 40% of its GDP, and it doesn't control its price. This is the definition of a third world country. So it can posture, it can try to claim things, but the objective reality is a fraying economy, which, by the way, has some impact on the riots in Siberia. We have riots too, but these are based on fundamental impoverishment that can't be solved. So we see the two central powers of Eurasia declining. And we throw into that the fact that the Europeans are not declining, but they're at it again, arguing with each other, expelling the British leaving them, the traditional European problem of fragmentation. Okay? Attacking Poland, Nazis in the German government. None of it's serious, but it's there again. Russia weakens. China is struggling. So what we see here is that Eurasia itself is suffering from the traditional problems it always had and weakening. So what will we see? We will see what happens constantly, the emergence of new powers. You know, nobody would have said in 1980 that China would be a great power. Nobody would have said in 1950 that Japan would become a great economic power. So you look and try to find out what powers are rising. Well, first, Poland. In a continent where Germany exists, which exports 50% of its GDP, and is truly hostage to its customers, and where Russia is crumbling, Poland is becoming more assertive. Watch, as a minor example, Belarus. Poland is a coherent, ideologically read religious country, and it has, since I wrote this 15 years ago, is transformed itself. The other country is Turkey. Turkey is now a naval power in the Mediterranean, operating in the Black Sea, sitting at the table with the Russians and the Americans as an equal, and the movement from what it was 20 years ago to what it is today is astonishing. But the third emerging country is one that has emerged. It is Japan. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. It does not suffer from massive internal social instability. It is constructing a navy very rapidly, and that's before they get rid of Article 9. After they get rid of Article 9, imagine. This is a power that could become a nuclear power perhaps tomorrow, certainly in 2 months. This is the power that the United States faced. And ultimately, from the American point of view, China does not threaten its fundamental interest. Its fundamental interest is command of the Pacific Ocean, because that ocean is the buffer that protects North America. Everything else you get from it is nice, but that's how North America is saved. Japan cannot help but challenge that. Japan, as in 1935, imports massive amounts of raw material. It has none of its own. And it imports them through waters that are controlled by the United States. And thus far, the United States has been very happy to protect those shipments and doesn't really care. But Japan, like any other country, has to assume, what if the Americans change their mind? What if they don't guarantee it? And then we face again the problem of the late 1940s, of the period before World War II. Then again, we will face the crisis of Japan needing to protect its access to resources, needing to protect its flank, needing to be certain that it keeps Russia at bay. It is not going to do this because it's evil. China is not doing what it is because it's monstrous, and the United States is not doing it because it's vile. These are the things that have to happen. You look at the map, and you think about it, and obviously this has to happen. Obviously China, when you look at the numbers, can't sustain itself without American consumption. Obviously Russia cannot survive unless the price of oil is stable and rising. Obviously Japan has to be concerned about its line of supply. And obviously each of these collide. And if you look at it this way, then the things that happened in 1900 and 1920 and 1940 and so on, they make sense. They're not evil walking, usually. They can be that too. But simply nations that have interests and are going to pursue those interests that care more about themselves than others. We've talked about a rule-based system. Well, who's going to enforce the rules? What country is going to say, well, I've lost, I'll cut my economy by 20%? It's very hard to get a rule-based economy. Yes, we had one during the Cold War. It was NATO, and everybody was afraid of the Russians, and there was rules, and the United States announced them and informed them. Now, the Germans aren't particularly impressed by us having rules. They go our own way. So when you take a look at the rule-based concept of liberalism, the rules have to have someone to enforce it. During the Cold War, what rules there were enforced by the United States and the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact was told what they were going to do, and NATO was pretty well told what they do. But now, who enforces the rules? The idea that we all accept the rules, even when it means a massive loss to our country, is about as reasonable as saying that we're going to do business, and I will continue to do business even if I lose all my money. I'll fight as hard as I can to keep it. And I'm afraid of the government, so I can't really steal, but I'll fight. The reality of today is the same reality as existed with Thucydides and the Greeks. It hasn't changed. The technology has changed, the rhetoric has changed, the weapons have certainly changed, but the fundamental thing is you protect your own. And the fundamental way to examine the question is, are they able to protect their own? And what do they need? So the first question to ask when we talk about the U.S.-Chinese relation, what does the United States need from China that it can't get elsewhere fairly shortly? What does China need from the United States? Where else can it find a market that dynamic, that demanding? So when we take a look at what they must have, and we forget the fact that a good businessman knows exactly how to build an image of success, especially when he's failing, then we can understand what they're doing. So when we look at the next 50 years, it is going to look like the last 2,000. There's no miracle coming. There have been diseases before, smallpox, far more deadly than this, diphtheria, cholera still stalks the world. Yes, we have the disease, and it will change our lives, but it will not change the fundamental reality of nations facing each other, sometimes fearing, sometimes with greed, sometimes with indifference, all of which are predictable if you get the chance to predict them. And this is what we have to remember. In that story that I told from 1900, every common sense assumption was blown to bits in 20 years. China came out of nowhere, but it didn't. It came very rationally. The United States came out of nowhere. It didn't. It came rationally. Japan came out of nowhere. Everybody is surprised because they're not looking. And this is the thing that me and Stu here in Korea. Because Korea sits between Japan, between China, south of North Korea, with the Russians not too far away. You live in a tough neighborhood, as we say in New York. And in that tough neighborhood, you need allies, and you have one, the United States. And you need to understand that alliance has a price. It doesn't come free. Just as the United States had to understand that its alliances don't come free. The United States needs Korea because all these nations have to be managed. And Korea needs the United States. So one thing we can predict, I think, is that the relationship with the United States that existed basically since 1950 will endure, because the problems facing Korea and the United States in the region have endured. We are still talking about the Chinese, We're still talking about the Japanese. We're still looking at the communist North. It hasn't changed. Therefore, your relationships don't. So let me stop there, and I guess I don't ask for questions here.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. It was a very, very interesting talk. I think I was surprised. Well, you talked about the fact that we're always shocked. Always, this is not the first time, so I felt a little better. I was interested, it was very interesting to see the map with North Korea, with North America right in the center, which sort of emphasized your point about North America being the stable power in terms of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and how it didn't have to really fight for its borders. And so you saw China to the side and Eurasia to the side, and of course the other islands, Africa and South America, which we could talk about later. And then also about the fact that, you looked at China, and although there's a lot of talk about China being the next superpower and about the rise of China, you sort of talked about their limitations and how you didn't see China becoming the global power that a lot of people are expecting at the moment. And I was also interested in your identifying the three upcoming countries, Poland, Turkey, and Japan, which I think or the countries that you also pointed out in your 2009 book. So I was interested to see that your predictions over 10 years ago still haven't changed in terms of the emerging powers in the world. So so you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of things to discuss. And today we are very fortunate to have with us two scholars that will help us really analyze the points that you brought up, and to really be able to flesh out the points that we talked about in the discussion. We have Professor Chung Jae-ho. Let's start from this point. We have Professor Chung Jae-ho here on my left. He is the, let me get my cue cards here. He's a professor of He's a professor at Seoul National University. We actually have two Seoul National University professors with us, representing the preeminent university in Korea. He is in the Department of the International Relations. He is a preeminent expert here in Korea of China and Northeast Asian affairs. Next to him, we have Professor An Deok-kun, who is also a professor at Seoul National University in the Graduate School of International Studies. He is also considered an expert in trade issues and trade law. So I would like to maybe start off by asking Professor Chung to share his comments and questions about Dr. Friedman's talk.
Thank you. I think in essence, your presentation was quite similar to the discussions that were given in your 2009 book, particularly concerning China. In that book, you projected that by 2020, China will never be a major world power. Of course, it all depends on the definition of what major world power is. And second, more importantly, I think, China will not hold itself together. And you said that here as well. And you mentioned about China being divided. China has this peripheral problems of Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, and so on and so forth. If that forecast should have any water at all, then it makes people wonder, why is the Trump administration pushing so hard to give troubles to China? Because if you believe that China is not going to be a major world power, thereby not threatening the United States, why would one U.S. administration will go that far to keep troubles? That's my first question. Second question, I had a very interesting encounter with young Korean people a couple of days ago. Of course, these are in their 20s. They don't really understand the historical or philosophical foundations of American democracy. And as you know, this young generation are they react to images rather than to written text these days. So what they see on TV, particularly the police brutality, the lootings on the streets, and the political divide, racial conflict in the U.S., and they ask me, what's the utility of American democracy now? I mean, United States used to maintain the normative leadership over the world. But as these young people look at the TV screens and they sort of relate those images to the weaknesses of American democracy, and does this image matter at all? In other words, when I read your 2009 book, fundamentally I think the spirit embedded in the book is the realist tradition. Military preponderance and power of the nation states and so on and so forth. So does soft power matter at all to make the United States sustain its primacy over the world? That's my second question. Third question, I think this one was not really sort of meted out in your 2009 book, but nevertheless, I mean, the new fad in international relations research these days is the so-called retrenchment. Countries decline, but that decline could lead to sort of revival. But then again, not every nation that declines may come back. Some may stay there and never come back, like Spain, Portugal, and so on and so forth. So one makes some countries come back, but not others. So in the first round, let me just throw in those three questions.
I think we'll have Professor An also ask his questions, and then we'll ask Dr. Friedman to sort of answer all of them at once, which is going to be quite a task, I know. But let's throw it over to Professor An as well.
Okay, thank you very much for a very insightful and enlightening speech. Let me draw your attention to economic aspect of the current situations. When we compare the situation in the 1980, 1990 to the current situation, in the 1980s, the service industry became very important. Probably how we live nowadays is almost formulated at that time, like a Visa Master, Walmart, and airline businesses. All those very remarkably the developed services industry could be internationalized with the incorporation into the WTO systems. At the time, U.S. Government tried to make it global standard by establishing the services rule in the WTO system. At the time, so to disseminate in a way is economic power, economic influence, they tried to make a multilateral trading system, global trading system. Now, 2020s, now we are experiencing remarkable digital transformations, and this time, US government's approach seems to be completely opposite. Instead of using multilateral system, they now try to strengthen economic blocks. Basically, the decoupling or the severing the relationship basically with the China. One of the key difference from that time and now is probably in that there. When Japan emerged as a new economic superpower, at the time we never talked about like that much economic integration between US versus Japan. It was always like a competitors. But now we talk about Chi-America. The China and US kind of formulated unprecedented like global supply chain. It was significantly integrated with each other. Now suddenly we try to decouple this system. So nowadays suddenly these economic conflict or economic war between two superpowers cause huge trouble to the world economies. That has not been experienced during the 1980s, 1990s. So this is one of the major difference I observe from the history. So reflecting all that, I would like to ask the question of how you see, I mean, in the next the 50 years, unprecedentedly, the economic situation has been hugely integrated with new digital technology, and will it be possible to decouple, or as Professor Chung earlier raised, whether completely like the eliminating the China influence or China factor can be feasible? I mean, as you know, just a couple of weeks ago, the Pompeo announced a clean network policy. If China is involved, then it is not clean. So they basically launched the digital trade war, digital economic war against China. So how you see the future of this economic conflict? I'll stop there.
Well, there's a fundamental difference between Japan and China. The United States, under the Bush 1 administration, had an intense confrontation with the Japanese. And the mood in the United States toward Japan, there were movies made about Japanese business, was intense. The Japanese had room for maneuver. The Japanese did something extremely intelligent. They restructured their financial system. They created an austerity that was not present, and the country took it. China doesn't have that option. There is no decoupling going on. If two businesses trade with each other and one wants to change the terms of the trade, this is a legitimate part of trade. going back to the Obama administration, the United States was charging China with manipulating currency values, but also not allowing, even though formally was required to, American goods into the market. So the first thing to understand is this did not begin with Trump. This was already going on with Obama. And the point was, the Chinese did not refuse to do these things because they were greedy or cruel or stupid. They didn't have the room for maneuver. They didn't have the room for maneuver because they're constantly looking not at the borderlands, but that part of China that did not participate in the growth. And also being concerned about the political commitment of the eastern coastal region that is paying the price for it. So what you had in the situation was, for the United States, an untenable situation. The liberal trading system does maximize wealth, but it does not address the question of distribution. And this is its defect. Because ultimately, it wants to take trade out of politics. But you can't do that. Because what happened in the United States was that basically, it really wasn't China, but China became the symbol of it and was involved. And China didn't mean anything bad. They were doing what they could. The Midwest was devastated. That overstates it, but we'll call it that. And the Democratic Party, that didn't speak like Trump, did, however, not respond to this problem. The position was, look, the GDP is growing. And the answer to that was the fact that the GDP is growing doesn't tell you about the political stability of the country. So I would argue that in the case of China and the United States, the Chinese could not modify their trading system, and the United States could not tolerate the Chinese system. The problem the Chinese had was they had no room for maneuver, the Americans did. Now, leaving all of Trump's speeches and everything else aside, okay, this was coming. And the Japanese handled the same problem in a very different way. They said, okay, we've run the course. Chinese couldn't do that. And the United States had the option. So I would not call it a decoupling. Firstly, there's a great deal of trade going on. Okay, I would rather want to say that one country in a trade relationship wanted to redefine the terms. There was nothing sacred with the terms that were there, and politically, no president really had the could have an option. Could you remind me what?
Oh, Professor Chung's
Yes,
questions.
I have lousy memory.
Oh, no. Okay. Good thing to let me know.
Or should I repeat?
Yeah. I think, well, he was talking about the fact that then why is, if the United States is so secure, then why is the Trump administration being so hard against China is, I think, was number one.
Well, let me take that.
Okay, there's one by one.
The Trump administration is not being particularly hard on China. It wants a new trade agreement. Its rhetoric is everything else, but it's the same criticism that the Obama administration had. The difference being that the Obama administration wouldn't pull the trigger. So we have this. Being hard on China, air attacks, these would be interesting blocking reports. This is simply a trade dispute that the Chinese have made to appear as if it was a completely illegitimate event. Trade disputes, and you're having Brexit and the same thing, but trade disputes are a normal part of the international trading system. You look at the way it was handled previously in other cases, I mean, this was simply saying, look, we want access to your market on the basis that you agreed to give it. And the Chinese didn't give it. So it was part of what you're saying. I mean, it appears to be aggressive. But the American public has taken the same position it took about Japan, not in Washington and New York, and which is that something has to be done. And what has been done has been really modest when you think about it. But for political reasons, any president would have to make it appear more. Now, the really interesting question is why the Chinese, knowing this, prefer to escalate the situation rhetorically by presenting it in a different light, And that has to do with Chinese internal politics. Xi, and the president of China has one primary job: manage the president of the United States. Because that relationship is critical. And Xi failed. In a number of other areas, Xi has failed. I would love to sit in a Central Committee meeting. But each side had domestic problems they had to address in the language that was appropriate to them. That other countries, France would be upset, really didn't matter to us. So when you're president of the United States and you have an internal economic problem that's being caused in the perception of the United States, we can argue that, okay, of China not living up to its trade agreements. So if there's any decoupling going on, and it isn't in the end.
But the question is not just about trade. It's about South China Sea. It's about Huawei. It's about Taiwan.
Yeah.
It's about Tibet,
Well,
Hong Kong. So all over. It's like an over-securitization of every issue. If the U.S. is so comfortable with the possibility that China will never become a global world power, why would they do that?
Well, first of all, the status quo ante is that the Americans have a presence in South China Sea. That China is not going to be aggressive against Taiwan, and so on. So the real question is, why have the Chinese postured themselves in the South China Sea and postured themselves against Taiwan in this way? The American position is on South China Sea is very simple. We won the Pacific in the war. This is fundamental to our national interest. We have no give on that. We are not about to blockade their ports. The Chinese are not going to get the United States to move on this. But when you take a look at all these issues, Huawei could have managed this situation much differently than it did. Okay? There is much technology which is imported from China. We depended on their pharmacies and so on. And I keep coming back to the brilliant work of the Chinese Information Ministry, which is in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, it is China that wants to change the status quo. And the United States, which responds with the wonderful rhetoric that we all know and love, which is holding the position as it is. So you've got the Chinese Air Force penetrating Taiwanese airspace. Now, as soon as the United States scrambles its planes, the Chinese announce this is more aggression from the United States. But in fact, what you have here is two reasonable countries trying to manage a situation. The economic situation is problematic. The situation in Hong Kong has had repercussions in China. So what the Chinese are trying to do is position themselves simultaneously as a victor and a superpower. As a victim, I should say. It's, it's understandable what they're doing. It's equally understandable in America as to keeping China from becoming a world power. Well, there's a price you pay for becoming a world power. How many died in World War II?
The second question, I think, had to do with the U.S.'s leadership. What's
Soft
going
power.
on within
power.
yes. So
Soft power is what you use when you don't have hard power. It's an old joke in the States. The point is, look, leadership, the United States, no country has an interest in leadership for its own sake. To be a leader, there has to be some benefits to you. We were a leader in Europe because we did not want Russia taking the European peninsula. But whenever somebody talks about American leadership not being there, it's usually they haven't given us what we asked for. So I would argue that the majority of Americans think the idea of being the world leader stinks. The United States was the first anti-imperial power. Deeply embedded in this is isolationism. In other words, to say that isolationism caused World War II, I don't think it's true. France, Germany, and these caused the war. We were just bystanders and didn't want to be into it. the extent to which the United States doesn't want to lead the world, because what the world means by leadership is risk-taking and expense, but where it needs to lead, as in the Korean Peninsula, it leads. But it is what Trump has done is what was inevitable. He's raised a question, exactly what are we trying to achieve in the Middle East? And if we're not doing anything, why don't we stop getting people killed and withdrawing them? This is not to praise Trump. It is to simply say, if you do what I try to do is get rid of all the speeches. Okay? Trump has decided to withdraw from the Middle East. It's exactly what the liberals wanted. But he did it. And so he has his own particular political problems, but he is kind of reshaping the American posture. Interestingly, for all the rhetoric about all the shift toward China, there's very little military movement in that area. It's a good speech, though.
Just follow up on that before we move on to your third question. You're talking about, the Trump administration, but let me ask you about the next 50 days and if we're going to continue to have a Trump administration or not.
Well, if for sheer amusement, maybe yes. But what I'll say is it won't matter. The idea that Biden is going to come in and radically change foreign policy, I don't even think Biden has a foreign policy. By default, he's going to continue doing what he was doing. So you have to understand, Trump arose because of a certain reality in the United States that came from a number of different forces, China being one. If he goes, those forces are still there. And one of the weaknesses of the Democratic Party is they can't address that because they are the party of the finance and so on and so forth. They reversed their role from the New Deal. So the answer is, I really would like Trump to go away because I've heard all his speeches and I'm bored. I've heard none of Biden's speeches. That'd be nice. But on the other hand, it doesn't matter. The American president, as I've talked before, is the weakest leader of the democratic world. He has the least power. And you see this constantly with Trump being dragged into court and sued and everything like that. You don't do that to a dictator. So the answer is the United States has dealt with far greater crises. The Civil War, the Depression. I remember being of that generation being told that the United States has lost the respect of the world because of Vietnam. And this is when I learned that, well, the respect of the world is nice to have, but
you can live without it.
The point being that the United States president has been drawn to the position over the past century where he is seen as the United States. Okay? And that isn't the case. And I'm embarrassed by Trump, but also amused. I mean, he's a very funny guy. He doesn't mean to be funny, but the point being, it doesn't matter all that much, guys.
And Professor Chung, if you want to maybe reiterate your third question.
Okay, my third question was about retrenchment. What makes the variations among the states? Some states succeeded in coming back, others don't. So what's the determinant of that variation?
Well, firstly, internal fragmentation. So in the case of China, you're seeing things that 10 years ago you would have never dreamt you'd see. I mean, you're seeing activity and Prime Minister Li being there, not being there. You're seeing a level of instability within society and outside. Look, China has a serious economic problem. There's a price to pay. So the United States will come back because it could create, over the next 20 years, domestic consumption. Also, not to mention World War II. Okay? The Japanese came back because they could impose austerity without having to declare it. So you need to have resilience, and the resilience comes from being able to manage the disappointment. And you can't manage it if you don't have a credible plan for solving it. And this is the weakness of the Chinese policy. They're having a problem. The first step is to admit it, because everybody knows it. The second step is to have a credible solution. But the problem of China right now, I think, is Xi and internal forces that are piling onto him. And so that I don't know, that I'm guessing.
One thing we haven't really addressed, and you only mentioned a little bit in your talk, is the current situation, the COVID-19 situation that we're in now. A lot of our general audience think, and we have been hearing about how the COVID-19 pandemic is a shift in the global geopolitical sphere, that it will create changes that we didn't even think about before. How do you look at the COVID-19 impact on geopolitical futures?
Well, thus far, relatively little, but we're at the beginning of this. If somebody had said back in February last year, you're going to go on social isolation for the next 5 years, we would have a very different response. So what we're doing here is boiling the frog, which is an American phrase. If you take a frog and throw him in the water and boil him slowly, he doesn't notice he's dying. So we are betting now on vaccines coming. Let's assume that it becomes obvious that this disease is not going away and we have no cure. Now you have a different dynamic. You start comparing it to smallpox and cholera and other diseases that we have lived with, and you say, look, this has a relatively low death rate compared to those. We didn't resort to these steps because, I mean, the problem is not only economic, it's social. The example I like to use is imagine a 5-year-old kid growing up and for the next 2 years has no playmates. This is essential. How does somebody carry out a courtship ritual, if I could put it that way, in this environment? In other words, how do you meet a member of the opposite sex, or whatever? Very difficult. So there are fundamental social functions that have been suspended. If it turns out, and I don't think it will, I think the vaccine will be found, but I don't know anything about vaccines, so I go by press releases. I mean, then we are going to see a reevaluation of risk, and it'll be a routinization of the system, because we're not going to be able to go for 3 years, 4 years. The medical profession says these things because they're doctors and they don't consider anything outside of that. But, I mean, how are we going to go to a meeting and have to distance ourselves from each other? I'll certainly do it for a year. But 1 year is going to be the moment it breaks. As to how it changes the international system, well, it's had a profound effect economically on the cost of maintaining it. The danger is that it slips into depression. The depression from a geopolitical point of view, a recession is a cyclical event that's managed by financials. A depression is the destruction of elements of the economy. So in the United States, we've seen massive destruction of the airline industry, but recoverable. You've also seen retail stores shut down, not recoverable. When we start reaching the point, and the variable we're looking at is bankruptcies. And when those start to, and they haven't mounted, so that's good, that's going to be the scary point, because that can be a 10-year problem. And as that happens, I assume the central banks are going to notice. But they're used to handling recessions.
Professor An, would you like to maybe raise the issue, the collapse of multilateralism, especially Dr. Friedman talked about the fact that there is no one to really enforce any of the global trade laws. How would you maybe raise an issue of how, in the future, do you see this kind of trend also happening?
Right. I mean, by 20 years, analysis raised by Dr. Friedman. I think this is very nice tool. If you think about the 20, and from 20 to 2020 is like a servicification period from the economic point of view. Global economy has been quite remarkably transformed into a service industry. So global economy has been very seriously integrated by the globalized services industry sector. And from 2020 to the next 20, clearly we will face digitalization period. Then, as I mentioned, during the past 20 years, it has been fortified by the global trading order. But if we have a current situation is maintained, then we will face like the economic divide or new Cold War or whatever. Is very conflicting or confrontational global economic systems. Probably one centered by U.S., the other the fighting fought by the China-centric economic region or area. Under that circumstance, do you see, any other, next players? Suddenly we see China emerged out of, do you see like Korea can be the next player, or Vietnam or India after the digitalization period to emerge as a quite interesting new player in the
If you think about China's emergence, it had one advantage, Mao Zedong. The situation in China was so poor that, as they say in the United States, is a dead cat bounce. It was going to rise. It also had a deep commitment to education. The Chinese understood and didn't have to preach it. Unlike many third world countries, the Chinese took to education at an extremely high rate. The weakness of the Chinese development was that it was regional education. The education you got in Shanghai was different than what other, but not so completely as to cause major unrest. So what you are looking for is a country with resources, a country with political discipline, and a population that responds to it. Okay? Size also matters. So it also matters that the United States wanted China to emerge and entered into a series of experimental relationships early on. And we were deeply involved. The American financing of the Chinese growth was extraordinarily important to have a patron. It had a patron, the United States. China's problem is it still wants the American patron, but only on Chinese terms. So that's going to be hard to do. So the question is, what countries do I see? Poland is one. Extreme discipline, extreme obsession with education, and a strategic position that makes a country like the United States or other countries, Germany, want to finance them. Turkey is the historic foundation of the Middle East. When the Middle East is quiet, it's the Ottomans who do it. And they're stirring again. Now, their economy is, this is the only one that I'm starting to question, because the inability of Erdogan did wonderful things but his inability to rationalize the economy for a long-term surge. Now, it's very well educated. It has countries that care a lot about how it does, but it simply cannot formulate an economic principle, not a plan. The plan is nothing but a principle. It is still using the principle it used before its surge. As for Japan, it doesn't have to recover. It has to make decisions. And that's just what's scary about Japan. It's not a question of getting there. It's a question of deciding they're going.
Then what about Korea? I think that was the
Korea has done extraordinarily well. You're the 12th largest economy in the world on the GDP, not the PPP, the real GDP. That's an extraordinary achievement for Korea. Your companies trade worldwide. The brands are respected by everyone. You have a range of products from kimchi, which I don't like, but all the way up to some of the most sophisticated electronic systems. Okay? You are playing in biomedical areas. I mean, you're not going to become China's successor, but in a relationship with a country with a market that you can really exploit, which you have. And you have done. So Korea is a country that is not searching for its future. It's found its future.
If I could just take that Korea point and then maybe move it forward a little bit. You talked about the fact that Korea is situated between Japan and China. So, but it is also in terms of its alliance between China and the United States, if you talk about two realms of power. So could you sort of look forward for us into how Korea can really be able to navigate these very turbulent geopolitical waters in the future?
Well, there's no future without risks for this case. Here's the problem. You present a direct threat to China because your peninsula closes in on waters that it needs access to. And if you become a base, and the U.S. has been very careful what it deploys here so it doesn't trigger China, the Chinese have to react to that. So there's that problem. In terms of the Japanese problem, they can bypass you altogether on the way to Straits of Malacca or whatever they want to do. Okay? Your problem is that you're going to find out what they decided to do when they do it. It's just too late. So you must develop an optional plan of options. You have to have scenarios and make prudent and limited investments. Your key strategic problem is to maintain your alliance with the United States. So long as you become our fundamental interest to a superpower, it will bear the burden. But it's a superpower that is idiosyncratic and speaks its language and no other. So the real fear that comes to me is I don't fear a Chinese attack. I fear a Chinese sense that it's being strangled. And you have an arm that's strangling them. So the one thing I would not like to see is American destroyers and aircraft stationed near your west coast. That would be a very bad signal to the Chinese. So you really have to put yourself in the Chinese position. The reason they're not going to try to go to war is they could lose. For some countries, losing a war is okay. Not for China. They can't manage that. So what they're doing is trying to be as aggressively appearing as possible without crossing the line. How will they read a threat from Korea? Now, if I were the Chinese, I'd say the U.S. had no reason whatsoever to put these troops there, these forces there, unless they meant aggression. I have to assume that. And now I have to take a step. Therefore, the U.S. is not even suggesting putting that there. I think the Americans are extremely aware of the Chinese sensibility. So here's a situation that was very much like the Cold War. You know why we didn't have a war? Neither the Americans nor the Russians wanted one. Nothing was to be gained from war. So wars occur when one nation or another believes they can benefit from it. Japan clearly benefited from, or thought it could benefit from this. So did Germany. Okay? But in this situation that we have right now, I don't think the Chinese want to take the risk. And the Americans certainly don't want to go to war. And what happened in the Cold War is both sides settled down to a situation where they signaled each other and spoke quietly to each other and did all these things. I would suspect that's going on with China as well. I would suspect that when those aircraft go to Taiwanese airspace, there happens to be no American aircraft in the region. I hope.
Well, to sort of lighten the situation just a bit, as I said, we got hundreds of questions from the general public, and I think your reputation as being the future foreseer has had many people asking questions that you couldn't possibly answer unless you had a crystal ball. Things like, will I have a job, 2 years from now, and things like that.
Oh, there's no problem. No. Because if you're going to ask that question, you would never have a job.
See, I will have a job because I'm not going to ask that question, but a lot, it sort of reflected a lot of the frustrations that people are feeling these days and the unknowing future that we are faced with. And when you brought up the subject of education, I think one of the things, we got a lot of questions on education for some reason. And we got this question from a mother of two teenage boys.
God
and
help her.
she was trying to say, yes, I was saying, yeah, so I feel her pain. So she was saying, so I have these two teenage boys and I need to educate them to be, ready for the future, next 50 years or the next 100 years. What should I, where should I, put them? What should they study? What will harbor their creativity or whatever you think they need to have in order to survive and thrive in the next 50 years?
Well, assuming she doesn't want to follow my path, which was to threaten to put them in Paris Island where the U.S. Marine Corps trains. I mean, assuming she doesn't want to do that, the answer is maintain your options, like nations. Know the possibilities, maintain them. I am a strong believer in the liberal arts. I am a strong believer in that if you have read the great books, you will have options. You also have to learn to do other things, but to me, the liberal arts is the option play, as you call it. So, that's the only advice I could give, and it's worth every penny of it.
Liberal arts, which I actually totally agree. But I actually want to ask our two professors as well. I mean, it's your opportunity and our opportunity to sort of garner sights about you have students. You are nurturing the next generation. Where do you think they need to focus in order to thrive in the future?
I always emphasize the importance of history.
History.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As Dr. Friedman shows us, actually the understanding history gives you a perspective to understand the whole situation. So I always emphasize the studying history. Unfortunately, not just in Korea, in many countries, academic curriculum, history became kind of the selective course instead of the mandatory class. So I don't think that's right direction.
I second that opinion. Actually, I got my master's degree in history, and I think that was really helpful for my PhD in political science. But back to your question, many students come to my office are asking exactly the same question. I always tell them to focus on what you like, not what other people say. Of course, it's a difficult challenge for them to choose what they really want. But, I mean, if you spend a lot of night thinking about that question, it will come to you. I think that's how I came to my profession, at least. So, if you choose what you really want to do, then you will put a lot of time into it, and you will excel yourself. And then, you will make your ends meet.
Well, if I'm going to chime in, I also agree with all three of you. Saying that liberal arts, including history, is great because I think it broadens your horizon so that you can follow your heart and given a lot of more choices. So that's our answer to our the mother of two boys. So succeed. The other question that was brought up for us is again focused more on the Korean Peninsula. It's about, again, because they believe that you can tell us. And it's a question that I've been asked a lot, and I've asked a lot. So we'll ask you, do you think Korea will be reunified in the next 50 years?
Yes. The current situation is tenable unless anything creaks. So my view is that, as I said to a number of people, North Korea's problem is that it's a 15th century Italian city-state ruled by the Borgias. And that's not a very stable system because inevitably you wind up in a civil war or the leader dies and the army doesn't know what to do and all sorts of things. They have done a brilliant job staying alive. I mean, the nuclear weapons are not nearly as impressive as the fact they're still there. But there's a weakness embedded in that system that we can't predict who will get insulted by who, but will bring them down. I mean, in my own family, I mean, I would hate us trying to be managing anything because of all the debates and everything else. Remember, a family has many dimensions that have nothing to do with statecraft. Memories, wrongdoing and stuff like this. And that's what we have here. So that every day we wonder if the sister is alive, it's not a problem for us. We actually have the situation controlled. The problem is it can go out of control because of their internal strangeness. But I think the outcome of that will be South Korea being very unhappy. Because if the regime falls, you will have to do an East Germany with them. And this will cost you a lot of money. So think about it what you want.
May I follow up on that? In your 2009 book, you actually specified the timing of reunification
2030.
before 2030.
Yeah.
So that's less than 10 years. Yeah. So what would catalyze the process?
But again, in a family, let's say that two ants suddenly exploded each other over something you have no idea what it was, but they remember it. All right? You can't predict it, but you can put down the probability of it happening. And the probability is this time we have not a leader emerging from the family who is quite as stable and strong as the others. And the sister is, I don't know why, I'm not going to play Borgia here, but what I'm saying is that how long can you manage to balance the malice that arises in families with the needs of the state? So, yeah. I'm looking at them, and they're very strange, and it's...
Well, there are both hopeful and concerning aspects of your prediction. Last question that I want to sort of ask is sort of bouncing off of what someone asked, but in your little crystal ball into the future, and looking into the future, do you and what you see, are you a pessimist or an optimist about the future?
Well, any reasonable person is an optimist and a pessimist. No, history is both. I mean, if you look at the past 100 years, would you say, sitting at the beginning, I should be an optimist or a pessimist? It's, firstly, if you're an optimist, what are you hoping for? And secondly, if you're a pessimist, what are you afraid of? So I can't answer that question, basically. I mean, I know what I want. It's probably not what you want. I don't know these
things. You can compare notes. Okay, with that, I think we are pretty much at the end of our discussion today. Thank you for really sharing with us your valuable insights. Also to our professors, Professor Chung, Professor An, for really allowing us to really delve into the points that were raised today. It really does seem to prepare us better for the geopolitical future that might lie ahead. Thank you all for your interest and your interesting questions. All of today's proceedings can be viewed afterwards on YouTube, and on the website chey.org. So with that, we will conclude, and may I wish you all a safe and prosperous future. Thank you.